How are you? I'm well. I'm doing good. Yeah, it'll take a minute.
Did you forget your coffee, or it doesn't fit in there?
It doesn't fit in here, yeah. So, do you guys like the seating arrangement? It was Randy Holbrook's idea. Any complaints? Randy Holbrooks at alteredmovement.com. All right. We've been speaking. Man, someone's trying to kill me. This little box right here, plugged in right behind me. Speaking of enemy love, we've been talking about enemy love. And it's a hard, if not impossible concept. And last week we spoke specifically. Hey, can I check on something real quick? Josiah and David, is our live stream going? Is there audio? Are you sure? Is it like really? Are you sure? Are they working on it? I'm not sure what's happening. I'm not like getting the confidence. Are you sure? Okay. All right. We've been speaking on enemy love, loving enemies, an extremely difficult concept, which is at the heart of the gospel and part of our DNA as followers of Christ. It's truly a non-negotiable. Last week we spoke specifically about Jesus' command to even pray for people who persecute us, and how difficult this is because it's both spiritual and personal. And sometimes we are offended and hurt very deeply by people, and this challenge from Jesus seems almost impossible. Now, what I love about our church is I think that we understand this concept really well. We are ideologically, it's always been this way, we're ideologically very different. There's a lot of diversity here in terms of thought and belief and theology. But we've learned this concept of loving each other, and I think we do it well. And I think because we do it well, it bleeds into the way the community sees our church. I think that people see us as a loving church. A church who embraces people, a church that's not judgmental, a church that is a window to Jesus. I think that when we see this, we believe it. I think when people walk into this building and they see this, they believe it. So maybe you'll never have a problem here with people being unloving, cruel. But this is a truth that exists out in the world. I mean, here, I believe that we love each other enough to give grace when we make mistakes. We give each other room to grow. We stick with one another. We ask questions and we want to learn. But what happens when things aren't so easy? What happens when things break down, when you are being mistreated, when a person or system is actively pressing you or dehumanizing you? What happens when someone is abusing or taking advantage or manipulating or actively and persistently doing harm to you? And I'm not talking about minor disagreements or our being offended by small mistakes. We know we should give grace there. We have to give people the room to grow. Grace and space. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the big, ugly stuff. Abuse and oppression and violence. Now, the easy answer when you're facing abuse and oppression and violence is to get out of there. Just move along. Right? Create a boundary, end the relationship, get out. But what if you can't? What if it's a boss or a relationship that you simply can't walk away from? Or what if it's not a person at all? What if it's a system of persecution or oppression? As I said last week, when we read the New Testament, Jesus says that people are never really our enemies. It's not people. It's systems of oppression and the evil in the world, the powers and the principalities having their way inside of people. And we can understand that, right? We can believe that, but that doesn't make being face-to-face with people who are yielding to that evil or to those systems easy, right? We can believe that it's not people, that people aren't our enemies. But when you're faced with something like that, evil people who are oppressing you, it's hard to be nuanced. It's hard to say, well, you're not really the problem. It's the evil in the world that's the problem that you're succumbing to. It's hard to feel that way. And sure, we understand that people may not be the ultimate problem. They may not be the real enemy, but they can be acting under the influence of the enemy, or acting under the influence of evil. What does love look like in a situation like this? What does love look like when we are under oppression or attack or the consistent mistreatment and persecution of people? Now, Jesus gives us three scenarios that are often misunderstood and misused, and I'm going to read the first one to you, and you're going to immediately recognize this, because I know you've heard this. In Matthew 5, note to self, order the projector bulb. Can everyone remind me to order the projector bulb so that I can see what's going on back there and I have to turn around? Noted? Who's sending me a text message? All right. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anybody slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Have you heard this before? Who finds this incredibly annoying? Can we be honest? Please. Love is here, and so is honesty. It's really annoying. Because maybe you learned it the same way I did. I remember telling my mother as a child that I was being picked on. And my mom, and she had the right intention, she says, well, honey, you know what Jesus said. Just turn the other cheek. And I thought then, as I do now, how absurd that sounds. Because if I'm on the playground and these kids are picking on me, and you know, hey buddy, sick burn, try that over here. How does that work? What does that do? And I think what happens is that when we read this passage and it's taught to us in that way, we see it as a lesson in weak and ineffective passivity that keeps us in relationships and situations that subdue and oppress and belittle people. Especially when you read verse 39 from the beginning, because it says, do not resist an evil person. And this is very confusing. We'll talk about this. But this is very confusing, because how many women and how many children and how many people in the margins, and there's just innumerable examples throughout history of every tribe and gender and ethnicity being squeezed and silenced and pressed and manipulated because of this verse. Having been told just to stay small because of this verse. This is a misunderstanding of the text, and it is a misuse. Now, Jesus is, of course, the most misunderstood and misused teacher in all of history. You see this everywhere. People using Jesus for things that Jesus has no part in. It's incredibly frustrating and hurtful. And we do this, and we don't understand Jesus because we don't take the time to work through the depth of context in his teaching. So sometimes we misuse Jesus because we can just be lazy. And other times we misuse him, and I mean people like me, people who are in authority and have a voice. We misuse the teachings of Jesus to leverage and subjugate and control people. I'm thinking when I say this about specifically women in the church. Now think about this for a minute. Jesus changes the dynamic of culture and how women are viewed in the New Testament, in his treatment of women, okay? He elevates them. He calls them apostles. You know, Mary Magdalene was the apostle of the apostles, okay? Jesus' most trusted friend. And yet, in the past 2,000 years, we've told women, you're not allowed to talk in church, right? You should just be real quiet, right? And we do this because we misuse and manipulate teachings of not just Jesus, but people like Paul, right? And so we do this all the time. We constantly misread and misuse Jesus' teaching for our own advantage. And I was reminded this last week of another man who was misunderstood and misused. A man who, as a friend of mine reminded me this week, was at the time of his life the most hated man in America, and only now the most loved. Who am I talking about? Dr. Martin Luther King. And you can't talk about the Sermon on the Mount without mentioning King, or people like Bonhoeffer, who maybe we'll talk about in a few weeks, or people like Gandhi. So many people inspired by the Sermon on the Mount that we're teaching through, people who have tried to apply it in modern context. But there's a sermon delivered by Dr. King in Montgomery, Alabama in 1957. And Montgomery, Alabama was a hotbed of racism and segregation. There was a deep hatred for human beings because of the color of their skin, and a hatred that expressed itself in the violence of beatings and lynchings and blown up churches. Blown up churches. And in this climate, Dr. King says something very profound. He speaks of the forces that are standing against the civil rights of black Americans in Montgomery. And he names these forces. He names them. And I'm going to read a little bit of the sermon to you. Oh, my friends, our aim must be not to defeat Mr. Engelhardt, not to defeat Mr. Sellers and Mr. Gale and Mr. Parks. Our aim must be to win their friendship, the friendship of Mr. Gale and Mr. Sellers and Mr. Engelhardt. We must come to the point of seeing that our ultimate aim is to live with all men as brothers and sisters under God and not be their enemies or anything that goes with that type of relationship. Our aim must be to never defeat them or humiliate them. Turn the other cheek, let's be friends. Let's tolerate and keep the peace and keep the status quo. Thoughts and prayers don't make waves. And if I read it like this, it would be a misuse. Because in all that flowery language that I cherry-picked from this sermon, I left out something really important. Because in the same sermon, Dr. King says, freedom only comes through persistent revolt, through persistent agitation, through persistently rising up against the systems of evil. Our aim, Dr. King says, is not to defeat or humiliate. Our aim must be to defeat the evil that's in them. So yes, peace and friendships. And no, people are not inherently enemies. It's the system. But he calls out the oppression and sin, which in his case is racism. He calls it out for what it is. It's evil. It's evil. And we don't want to defeat and we don't want to humiliate, but those who are participating in oppression or abuses must come alongside of us to the realization of what they have done and agree with us on a new righteous path forward. So if we're going to be friends, there must be some agreement and movement on the part of the unjust. And that does not happen by doing the same things over and over and over and over again. And this is what Jesus is saying if we pay attention. And this morning, we're going to pay attention. Jesus is giving us a scenario where he is describing a public shaming. If anybody slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And so the smack on the right cheek was a way of putting someone in their place. If I wanted to humiliate you, I would use my right hand and the back of my right hand to smack you on the right side of your face. That's not to hurt you. If I wanted to hurt you, I'd punch you, right? That's how you hurt someone, you punch them. Me smacking you is humiliating you. It makes you feel small. It makes you feel beneath me. It makes you feel humiliated. How would you feel if I smacked you on the right side of your face with the back of my hand? There's a word in pop culture for what that is. I'm not going to say it here, but you know what I'm saying, don't you? I see all you heathen people laughing. You're not supposed to know what I mean. You've been watching HBO or something, okay? How do I know? Research. That's what you call sermon prep. How would you feel if I smacked you with the back of my hand on your face? Now, if I did this to you in this culture, right? If I'm a Roman soldier and I smack you on the back with the back of my hand on your face, what could you do? You could hit me back if you wanted to be executed. You could go home in anger and stew about it, or you could offer me your other cheek, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. Randy, I've been wanting to do this for a minute. Come here. Randy's growing a mustache. Just think we should acknowledge that handsome face. Okay, come here. Now, so I'm a Roman soldier. You're a Jewish shepherd, right? And I'm going to do this, and you know what the word is in your head. Like, I'm doing this, right? This is me dehumanizing you and making you feel small, okay? Now let's do it again this way so everyone can see, okay? Like this, okay? Like this, okay? Right? Now what happens if you turn this way and point to your other cheek? Now I need to smack you with this same hand, because this is the smacking hand, as an equal. Do you see? Come here. I smack you this way, I'm dehumanizing you and showing you that I'm better than you. You offer me this one? Oh. Now I have to smack you as one who is an equal, one who is on the same level, one who stood up and said, you don't get to do that to me. You don't get to make me feel small. I am not lower than you. I'm on the same level as you. And what's happened is I've given you all my dehumanizing violence, and you're absorbing it and saying, no. How about right here too, with the front of your hand, like you'd smack an equal, because that's what I am to you. And when he's done that to me, it confounds me and surprises me, and I don't know what to do next, because you've told me with your action that you and I are the same, that you have dignity as a human being, and I can't take that from you with all of my violence. Do you see the difference? Give it up for this guy. That's not passivity. It's a reorientation of powers. It subverts authority and shows that the true power is in the one who can resist in a way that disarms and confounds. If you turn the other cheek, you've absorbed my violence, and now I'm forced to respond in a different way. And this is the theme that we see in Jesus when he's asking us not to be passive, but to be creatively nonviolent in a way that disarms powers. And this is the cross in a nutshell. Jesus disarms powers and principalities through willing nonviolence, which removes the authority of the powers and demonstrates the all-sufficiency of love. In Montgomery, Alabama, a 42-year-old civil rights worker sitting in her seat on the bus was asked by a bus driver to move to accommodate a white man who did not feel like standing up. He thought it was his right to just take her seat because he thought that he was better than her. Here's what he's doing. You see? What does she say? I'm not moving. I'll pay the fine. I'll go to jail. She did both. But I'm not below you, and this is my seat. It belongs to me. I'm sitting here. This is how the Montgomery bus boycott started. And it took over a year. But Rosa Parks created a movement that forced legislation and change. But what we see here is a clear example of subversive, defiant, love-inspired civil disobedience. This is exactly what Jesus is asking us to do. This is exactly what he's inspiring inside of us in these words that are so often misused. What Jesus is teaching is that we can take ownership of our dignity and demand respect and equal treatment from people who are dehumanizing. Because no person has the right to take that from me because I am created in the image of God. I belong to him. So turn the other cheek to show who you are. A human that demands respect. But Jesus has more to say. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. And this is really hard to understand, and we really have to sort of sink into the context in which Jesus is speaking, because it seems like more passivity. Here's what's going on in the background. If you're in first century Palestine and everyone has a tunic or a cloak, it's the most valuable possession that you owned. It was protection, it was safety, it kept you warm and protected. But the law said that if you owed me money, until you paid me back, I could take your tunic from you, but I had to give it back at nighttime. I could take your tunic to remind you that you had to pay me back, but for your safety, I had to give it back to you at nighttime, so you're protected. But if I was being a real jerk, I might say, oh, there's a restriction on me taking your tunic. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take your shirt, because I can keep your shirt. And when the Bible says shirt, it really means like your underwear, right? Like it's a garment that goes all the way down. Do I have to tell you that certain clothing is uncomfortable to wear when you ain't wearing underwear? Do you wear wool without an undershirt? What's a tunic made out of? So me taking your shirt is me saying, hey, I can get away with this, and it's going to put you in pain. It's going to make you uncomfortable and scratchy and sweaty. I'm taking away your comfort and dignity. But what Jesus said is to give the person, if a person insists on taking your shirt, your underwear, give him your tunic too. Give them both. You would say, well, why would I do that? This person is acting unjustly, Jesus, and you are telling me to give them more? Because if I give them more, and I've got nothing, and now I'm naked and exposed and full of shame and embarrassment. And maybe that's the point. Not so that you are embarrassed, but so that my nakedness is a way of bringing you a sliver of shame that brings inside of you a change of heart. Because if you're trying to dehumanize me, and I give to you everything I have, and I'm saying publicly, and this is what Jesus is saying, hey, look what they've done to me. They've left me with nothing. I'm exposed. Look at this injustice. Then the community starts to pay attention. And you've made yourself vulnerable, but you've also taken back the power. Here's what this looks like practically. You've heard of Gandhi, Indian man, civil rights leader. We would call him a Hindu, but it would be hard not to also call him a follower of Jesus, because he read the Sermon on the Mount 2 times a day for 40 years. Have you done that? 2 times a day for 40 years. In 1930, Gandhi, who worked for the independence of the Indian peoples, began a 240-mile march from his home to the sea. 240 miles. Why? Because British occupiers taxed salt and did not allow the Indian people to collect or produce salt. Do you know that salt is important? Not just for the way you flavor your food, but for the preservation of food as well. This is a natural resource. Imagine not being allowed to gather salt. This doesn't belong to people. It belongs to people. So he marches 240 miles with 78 people so that he could grab a handful of salt and say, this is not yours. This is ours. And millions of people watched him do this, and they started doing the same thing. So this nonviolent protest inspired millions of others to cultivate and collect their own salt. 60,000 people were arrested. But the whole world was watching. You want to take our money? Here, take our time and our energy and our bloody feet as we march. And take our freedom too. Throw me in jail and do this as the world watches. Take my shirt. Take my cloak too. This is the same thing that happened. As civil rights workers, led by John Lewis and others, marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965, 78 million people watched on TV as 600 men, women, and children were brutalized and beaten and gassed and chased by horses. All because they wanted to cross a bridge to take a walk to Montgomery, Alabama, to talk about their right to vote. take my shirt and take my tunic too. And the world will see the evil inside of you. And they will demand justice. And they did, both in India and in Alabama. And if you asked those brave marchers, fighters, if they had love in their heart, they probably would have denied it. Maybe some would. I don't know. But it was absolutely love. Because you cannot endure that suffering. You can't endure that suffering and not seek to destroy your opponent unless you believe that just like you, they have a dignity and decency that is merely clouded by a temporary evil. It is my love for you and your dignity that gives me the courage to subvert your authority and the evil that exists inside of you. And if we press on with that belief, then we can understand that the evil in our opponent can give way to the better angels of our nature. Jesus gives a final scenario. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them too. And you've heard this in popular culture, certainly. Go the extra mile, right? You've heard that expression? Go the extra mile? You remember when Jesus was carrying his cross to a place of execution, he physically could not carry it anymore. And the Romans asked a man named Simon to carry it for him. This was allowed by law. A Roman soldier was permitted to force you to carry his gear for him. He could just randomly choose you and treat you as though you were some kind of pack animal, like a mule, and carry his stuff. But he could only do this for 1 mile. Just 1 mile. And as Jesus gave this Sermon on the Mount, he would have been communicating to a number of men who've experienced this. One day they were out with their sons going for a walk, and a Roman would have chosen to dehumanize and embarrass and humiliate this man and make him walk with his gear like some animal. Jesus understands this. Notice his solution. If anybody asks you to go 1 mile, go a 2nd mile too. Why? Well, you may have power in the 1st mile, right? Like, you made me walk 1 mile with you. Okay, I'll do that. But I'm going to go a 2nd mile. Why? Because you have power over me in the 1st mile. But if I choose in my own agency to walk another mile with you, I get the power back. I've chosen to do that, not you. But guess what's going to happen on that 2nd mile? You aren't forcing me. I'm choosing. And since I'm choosing, that means that we're equals. And as equals, we start having conversations about life and family, and suddenly we are no longer enemies because you see me for who I am. And maybe 2 miles turns into 10. You no longer see me as someone beneath you. In the 2nd mile, allies are won and dignity is restored. 1971, black families in Durham, North Carolina were fighting for school integration, and white families wanted the schools to remain segregated. So the local government organized a 10-day debate. A local civil rights leader named Ann Atwater was the spokesperson for the black families. And I just want you to try to understand for a minute this scenario. And C.P. Ellis, a member of the KKK, represented the white families. Now imagine being this woman and taking part in this absurd process. And friends, this is only 50 years ago. 50 years is not a long time, right? There's people here who are older than 50. This is when maybe you were a teenager or a child. This is when your parents were children or teenagers. This is not a long time ago. The absurdity of a process where there was a debate to whether or not children could be in school together. This is absurd. And you're this woman, and your opponent embodied something evil and terrifying. But this was a necessary process for the right outcome. Okay. Anne says, okay. I'll walk that mile. Better yet, I'll go 2. And this is what this woman had the courage to do. Because I'm going to ask this man about his children. And I'm going to talk about my children too. And I'm going to treat him like a human, even if that's not how he sees me. And through a series of conversations over 10 days, this man changes his mind. He tears up his Klan card publicly, and he becomes a lifelong friend of Anne, as well as a civil rights activist. Now, it's worth noting, and this is important because we don't want to sterilize these things, that our process doesn't always look like Jesus from the start, because this woman wanted to stab that man. She said so in her own words. She said, he was saying things about my children and calling us names, and I had a knife ready for him in the parking lot. And my pastor grabbed my arm. Sometimes you just got to listen to your pastor sometimes, right? My pastor grabbed my arm, and he says, don't give them the satisfaction. And so we kept working. It doesn't always look pretty. People are people. Humans are humans. Hurt people hurt. It's not always fancy and smooth. And really, we don't always see an end. There's still racism in Montgomery, Alabama. There was still racism in Montgomery after the bus boycotts. There's still injustice in India. C.P. Ellis wasn't suddenly cured of racism after 10 days. This is a process. We keep working and we keep doing this subversive love because it's the only thing that works, but it's never pretty. And it always requires work. Endless, tireless work. But the process started and began moving only after movements of subversive love. Here's what Anne said about her friendship with CP. She says, I often wonder how CP and I both changed enough that we were able to work together, to even become friends. In my church, the preacher says that if you want to be like Jesus, you must be born again. That really is the only way I can describe it. Something came into our lives those 2 weeks, and we spent time working together on the Save Our Schools meeting. And the blinders came off, and we both saw that our fighting with one another wasn't doing anything to help those children. We didn't become friends because we wanted to. What happened really was we saw how much we had in common. And then we couldn't imagine not being friends. Why? Because he moved in the direction of justice. He moved. I wish I had a video so you could hear the man say it himself. It's just so much better. But I'll have to do. Oh, my friends, our aim must not be to defeat Mr. Engelhardt, not to defeat Mr. Sellers and Mr. Gale and Mr. Parks. Our aim must be to defeat the evil that is in them. Period. But our aim must be to win the friendship of Mr. Gale and Mr. Sellers and Mr. Engelhardt. But they gotta move. Anne defeated the evil inside that man. She saw it for it was. She stood up to it. She changed community. She helped people by going the extra mile. And we all have that ability. Every single one of us. All of us have the ability. So what's it all mean? It means that Jesus was right. There are, and always have been, people in the world who are clouded by evil. And they're not the enemy, but they're clouded by something that must be defeated. And there's people in your life that are working in a direction that seems to harm you. And you can try all sorts of stuff. You can try violence, and you can try hate. And this is what we do, right? This is just what we do. It's easy. You can try matching brutality with brutality, but it's never going to give you the outcome you want. Is it working? Does it feel good? Just more of the same. Our natural desire is to protect ourselves by hurting others, to win peace through war, to gain freedom through punishment, but it's just the same cycle of violence and anger and destruction and hatred. Being weak and passive and curling up into a ball is not the answer. It's just as ineffective as violence and anger and hostility. It's just as ineffective. That doesn't work either. And so this is what Jesus means when he says, do not resist an evil person. We're not going to misuse that scripture. What he's saying is, do not attack or repay in the same way they have harmed you. Stand up to it in a way that is courageous and strong, but disarms and teaches and rebuilds. That's the Jesus way, and it works. And it can feel so tiring, but you keep doing it. You keep doing it. It is my belief and total commitment that this is the only thing that makes any difference in the world in the face of all the hurt and cruelty we see. And if you are feeling that tension, test him in this. Test him. And here's what's going to happen. It's going to feel impossible. And if it starts feeling impossible, if it starts feeling like it's not working, if it starts feeling like it's so hard and costs so much, then you're identifying with Jesus and walking in his power, and you keep moving and pressing. And you keep moving and pressing, because that's when you're going to see it. Test him in this. And maybe you can begin to turn the tide and change the atmosphere in your life too.